I went into the attic looking for a suitcase. I came down holding a truth I was never meant to read. And from that moment on, my childhood no longer belonged to me. The attic had always been my mother's no man's land. Hot in the summer, dusty year-round, and filled with boxes no one had opened since we moved into the house. After her funeral, it felt wrong to be up there, like I was trespassing inside her silence. But my daughter needed an old suitcase for a school trip, and I told myself this was just a practical task. In and out. No memories. I was wrong. Tucked behind a broken lamp and a stack of yellowed newspapers was a small cardboard box, taped shut with care instead of neglect. My name was written on the lid. Not in marker. In my mother's handwriting, soft, looping, unmistakable. My hands started to shake before I even opened it. Inside were a few photographs I'd never seen, a pressed daisy that crumbled when I touched it, and an envelope. Thick. Cream-colored. Sealed. No stamp. Just my name again, written slowly, as if she'd paused between letters. I remember sitting down hard on the attic floor, dust clinging to my black dress. The house was quiet in that deep, aching way it gets after people leave with casseroles and condolences. I told myself I didn't have to read it. That some things were meant to stay buried. But I'd lived my whole life believing my mother told me everything that mattered. Believing the story of who I was, where I came from, was settled and safe. The envelope felt heavy, not with paper, but with years. When I finally broke the seal, my mother's voice came back to me, not gentle this time, but trembling. The first line stole the air from my lungs. If you are reading this, it means I waited too long to tell you the truth. I didn't know it yet, but those words were about to change every memory I had ever trusted. I read that first line over and over until the words blurred. I waited too long. My mother had never waited too long for anything. She was early to school pickups, early to birthdays, early to apologies. Whatever this was, it had scared her enough to delay it for decades. I unfolded the letter carefully, as if it might fall apart like the daisy. She wrote that she loved me more than her own breath. That none of what followed changed that. It felt like the way doctors speak before bad news, soft words trying to cushion a hard truth. Then she began telling a story I had never heard. She wrote about being 21 and in love with a man who promised her a future but vanished the moment she told him she was pregnant. About the weeks she spent sleeping on a friend's couch, hiding morning sickness behind forced smiles. About how my grandparents, strict and frightened of shame, gave her one option: give the baby away, or leave. I stopped reading. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it. I had grown up believing my parents were high school sweethearts. That my father died when I was young. That my mother carried that grief quietly, like a badge of loyalty. The letter shook in my hands as I kept going. She wrote that she never gave the baby away. She wrote that she couldn't. Instead, she disappeared for a year. New town. New name. And a man who agreed to raise a child who wasn't his, as long as the truth never followed them home. That man was the father I buried when I was 9. The attic felt like it was tilting. Every memory, birthday candles, scraped knees, bedtime stories, suddenly carried a question mark. Had he known? Had he loved me anyway? Or had love been part of the bargain? My mother wrote that she planned to tell me when I turned 18. Then again at 25. Then after my wedding. There was always a reason to wait. Always a fear that the truth would cost her me. At the end of the page, the ink darkened, like tears had soaked into the paper. You deserve to know who you are, she wrote. Even if it means you forgive me from a distance. I pressed the letter to my chest and cried, not loud, not dramatic, but the quiet kind that cracks something open and leaves it changed forever. And I realized the envelope hadn't just revealed a secret. It had given me a choice I never asked for. I stayed in the attic long after my legs went numb, staring at the slanted ceiling like it might offer answers. My mind kept circling back to the same question, sharp and relentless. If he wasn't my biological father, then who was he to me? I carried the letter downstairs and sat at the kitchen table where my mother used to drink her tea every morning. The chair across from me was empty, but I could almost see her there, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes watching me carefully, waiting for a reaction she would never witness. The man I called Dad had been gentle in a quiet way. Not overly talkative, not big on grand gestures. He showed love through routine, cutting apples the same way every night, fixing loose cabinet handles, standing in the doorway until I was safely inside. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, my mother collapsed in a way I'd never seen before. I thought it was grief for a lost love. Now I wondered if it was something heavier. I pulled out the photographs from the box. One showed my mother younger than I'd ever known her, standing beside a man with kind eyes and an uncertain smile. His arm hovered near her back, not quite touching, like he wasn't sure he had the right. On the back of the photo was a date, 1 year before my birth, and a name written faintly in pencil. Daniel. Not my father's name. My chest tightened as memories rearranged themselves. How Dad never talked about my baby photos. How my mother took charge of school forms, medical histories, anything that asked too many questions. How no one ever mentioned relatives on his side. Had he agreed to raise me knowing I wasn't his? Had every "I'm proud of you" been an act of generosity instead of obligation? The thought didn't cheapen his love. It deepened it. At the bottom of the box was another envelope, smaller this time. No name. Just a folded note inside, written in a different hand, firmer, more deliberate. If you ever read this, it began, know that choosing you was the best decision of my life. I covered my mouth, tears spilling freely now. The truth hadn't taken my father away. It had given him back to me in a way I never expected. But one question still remained, burning and unresolved. Who was Daniel? And did he know I existed? I tried to ignore the name for days. Daniel. I said it silently while washing dishes, while driving to work, while lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. It followed me like a song you can't stop humming. I told myself it didn't matter. I had already lost one parent. I didn't need to go looking for another. But the letter didn't let me rest. My mother had written one final paragraph I hadn't noticed before, squeezed into the margin like an afterthought she couldn't quite let go of. I never told him about you. I was afraid he would take you away, or worse, refuse you. I hope you understand why I chose silence. That sentence hurt more than the rest. Not because of Daniel, but because of my mother. Because fear had guided so many of her choices, and I had lived inside the consequences without knowing. One evening, I pulled out my laptop and typed his name into a search bar. It felt disloyal, like I was betraying the man who raised me. But curiosity has a way of sounding like responsibility when it's loud enough. There were dozens of Daniels. Old yearbook photos. Wedding announcements. Obituaries. I scrolled until my eyes burned. Then, just as I was about to close the screen, a familiar face stopped me cold. The same eyes from the photograph. Older now. Grayer. But unmistakable. He lived 3 hours away. My heart started racing as if I'd already made a decision. I stared at the address, my finger hovering over the mouse. I could close the laptop and keep my life intact. Or I could open a door my mother had spent her life holding shut. That night, I dreamed of the attic again. The dust. The box. The envelope. Only this time, when I opened it, it was empty. I woke up knowing silence was no longer an option. The next morning, I wrote him a letter. I didn't say who I was. Not yet. I only said I was looking for someone who once knew my mother, and that the past had found its way back to me. I mailed it before I could change my mind. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt terrified. After I mailed the letter, time slowed in a cruel, unfamiliar way. Every day felt stretched thin, like it might tear if I pulled on it too hard. I checked the mailbox far more often than necessary, pretending I was just being thorough, not hopeful. At work, I smiled through conversations I barely heard. At home, I replayed memories on a loop, my father teaching me how to ride a bike, his steady hands guiding the seat, his voice calm when I wobbled. I realized then how love isn't proven by blood, but by presence. That truth anchored me when my thoughts drifted toward Daniel. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Just as I started convincing myself that silence was an answer, an envelope appeared among the bills and flyers. Plain. No return address. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys trying to open the door. I sat on the couch and stared at it for a long time. It felt heavier than paper should feel. Heavier with possibility. Inside was a short letter, written neatly, carefully, like someone afraid of saying too much or too little. He said he remembered my mother. Spoke of her kindness, her stubborn courage, the way she laughed with her whole face. He said he had often wondered what became of her, and whether she found the peace she deserved. Then came the line that made my breath hitch. If there is something you need to tell me, I am listening. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. This was the moment my mother had avoided for a lifetime. The moment where truth could either connect or destroy. That night, I told my daughter I loved her more than anything. She laughed, teased me for being dramatic, and hugged me anyway. Holding her, I finally understood my mother's fear. How easily love can turn into something fragile when secrets sit between people. I wrote back the next morning. I told him my name. I told him my mother's. And then, slowly, I told him who I was. I mailed the letter before courage could fade into regret. And as the envelope slipped from my fingers, I realized I wasn't just waiting for his response. I was waiting to meet a version of myself I had never known. His reply came faster this time. Only 4 days. I noticed the handwriting immediately, careful, but not cautious anymore. Like someone who had already crossed a line and decided to keep walking. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where I'd first read my mother's confession. Some part of me believed places remember things. That they hold echoes. If that was true, this table had heard enough truth for a lifetime. He didn't ease into it. He wrote that he had suspected once. That my mother disappeared so suddenly, with no explanation, had haunted him for years. That when she never reached out again, he assumed she had chosen a different life. He said he respected that, even though it hurt. Then he wrote the sentence I wasn't prepared for. I always wondered if there was a child. The room felt impossibly quiet. Not the heavy silence of grief, but the sharp stillness before something breaks open. He wrote that if my mother had told him, he would have stayed. That he would have done anything to be part of that child's life. That reading my letter had filled him with joy and sorrow in equal measure, joy that I existed, sorrow that he had missed everything. I found myself crying for a man I had never known. Crying for birthdays he never saw, for scraped knees he never kissed better, for questions neither of us were allowed to ask until now. At the end of the letter, he asked gently, almost shyly, if I would consider meeting him. Not as an obligation. Not as a replacement for the father I loved. Just as two people connected by a truth that had waited long enough. I folded the letter and stared out the window. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything feel unfinished. I thought of my mother. Of how fear had shaped her choices, but love had shaped her intentions. I whispered into the empty room, I'm trying to understand. That night, I stood in my daughter's doorway and watched her sleep. Her chest rose and fell, steady and sure. I wondered what truths I would someday have to explain to her. What silences I might choose, believing I was protecting her. By morning, I had my answer. I wrote back and said yes. Not because I needed another father, but because the envelope in the attic had taught me something my mother never learned in time. That truth, even when it's terrifying, is still a form of love. I almost turned the car around twice on the drive there. Once when the highway sign confirmed the distance, and again when my phone buzzed with a message from my daughter asking what time I'd be home. Life doesn't pause for revelations. It keeps going, even when your hands are shaking on the steering wheel. We agreed to meet at a small cafe halfway between our towns. Neutral ground. Somewhere neither of us had memories yet. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, my back to the wall. I ordered tea I didn't drink. When he walked in, I knew immediately. It wasn't his face. It was the way he paused just inside the door, scanning the room slowly, carefully, like someone afraid of missing something important. When his eyes met mine, his expression shifted, caught between disbelief and something painfully tender. He didn't hug me. For that, I was grateful. He sat across from me and said my name softly, like he'd been practicing it. I nodded, suddenly unsure what to do with my hands. We talked about small things at first. Weather. The drive. The coffee. Every ordinary word felt extraordinary under the weight of what sat between us. Eventually, he told me stories about my mother. How she insisted on walking home even in the rain. How she loved old songs and sang them slightly off-key. I laughed through tears, hearing pieces of her I'd never known. Then he stopped and looked at me, really looked, and said, "You look like her when you're thinking." Something in my chest loosened. I told him about the man who raised me. About his quiet kindness. About how safe I'd felt my entire childhood. Daniel listened without jealousy, without defensiveness. When I finished, he said simply, "I'm glad you were loved." That sentence mattered more than he knew. When we stood to leave, there was no dramatic moment. No promises. Just an understanding that something fragile had begun. As we parted, he asked if we could stay in touch. I said yes. Driving home, I realized I wasn't torn between two fathers. I was held by the truth of both. The days after meeting Daniel were strange. Ordinary life resumed, but every conversation, every quiet moment, carried a shadow. I thought I had prepared myself for all the emotions, the relief, the curiosity, the joy, but I hadn't counted on regret. Not regret for myself, but for my mother. I sat in her old chair, the one she always claimed was too small for her, and I imagined her reading that envelope years ago, trembling over what she should reveal. I thought of all the moments she had held back, believing silence was protection. But silence, I realized, can weigh heavier than truth. I called my daughter over, and we went through old photo albums together. Her fingers lingered on the pictures of me as a child, and she asked questions I had no answers for. I tried to keep the story light, skipping the hardest parts, but even a simplified version couldn't hide the absence that had always existed. That evening, I returned to the attic. The box was still there, waiting for someone else to discover it, I thought, or maybe for me to finally understand its power. I held the envelope one last time, tracing the edges with my fingers. Every fold, every crease, felt like a heartbeat. I realized then that life isn't just about uncovering secrets. It's about deciding what to carry forward and what to leave behind. My mother had carried hers for decades, and now it was my turn to carry the knowledge with grace, not fear. And in the quiet of the attic, I promised myself I would never let fear dictate silence again, not for my daughter, not for anyone I loved. The days that followed were a delicate balance. I found myself navigating two worlds, the one I had always known with the father who raised me, filled with comfort and familiarity, and the new world Daniel had opened, rich with questions and possibilities. We exchanged letters and calls, slowly building a connection that had been denied to us for decades. He shared memories of my mother I had never heard, her laughter, her stubborn streak, the way she would insist on making her favorite pie even when we were late for school. Each story stitched a new layer of understanding into the tapestry of my life. Yet, the connection came with its challenges. I had to learn to separate the love I had always known from the curiosity and longing Daniel stirred. I had to accept that no one could replace the father who raised me, but that it was possible to embrace someone I had never met as part of my history. One evening, my daughter asked me to tell her about the other grandfather. I hesitated, realizing how carefully I had to frame the truth for her young mind. I didn't want fear to govern her understanding, nor did I want to paint anyone in shadows. I told her that some stories are complicated, but love can exist in many forms. That night, I wrote a long letter to Daniel, one that I didn't send immediately. I wrote about the life I had lived, the love I had been given, and the questions I still carried. Writing became my bridge between what I had always known and what was now possible, a way to honor both the past and the emerging future. By the time I folded the letter, I understood something vital: life doesn't demand that we choose one truth over another. It asks only that we learn to carry all of them with compassion and courage. A week later, I found myself back in the attic again, drawn by a need I didn't fully understand. The box still sat in the corner, its contents carefully preserved as if waiting for me to piece together the fragments of my mother's life. I pulled out the photographs I hadn't looked at closely before and noticed details that had escaped me: a necklace she always wore, a faint smile that hinted at private joys, hands folded in ways that spoke of patience and sorrow. I realized I had spent so many years viewing her life through the lens of what I thought I knew: her sacrifices, her grief, her quiet strength. But now, with the letter, the photographs, and Daniel's words, I could see her fully: a young woman navigating impossible choices, a mother doing her best in a world that demanded perfection. I spent hours cataloging the contents of the box, arranging each item on the dusty floor. Every piece told a story. Every photograph, every pressed flower, every crumpled receipt revealed the choices she had made to protect me, to keep a fragile sense of normalcy intact. By the time I left the attic, I felt closer to her than I ever had in life. Not because I had learned every secret, but because I had come to understand the courage that had guided her decisions. And in that understanding, I found a strange peace, a knowledge that love, even when imperfect, can endure across time, absence, and silence. As I descended the stairs, the envelope in my hand felt lighter. The truth, though painful, had given me a way to see her not just as my mother, but as a person. And that perspective, I realized, would shape how I lived and loved for the rest of my life. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I began to meet more regularly, always cautiously, always aware of the history that separated us. Each encounter was layered with emotions I hadn't anticipated: curiosity, sorrow, hope, and at times, guilt. But slowly, those meetings became easier, more natural, as if the years of absence had been a long pause in a conversation we were now resuming. We shared family stories, laughed over memories of my mother that neither of us had fully captured before, and even cried together when we realized how much time had been lost. I found comfort in his presence, not as a replacement for my father, but as a living connection to my mother's past. One afternoon, we visited my childhood home together. Standing in the attic, Daniel held the box and gently lifted the envelope that had started it all. He looked at me with a softness that made my throat tighten. "She wanted you to know the truth," he said quietly. "And I think she knew you'd handle it with grace." In that moment, I realized forgiveness wasn't only for the living. It was for the past, for the people who made the best choices they could with the knowledge they had. It was for me, too. Leaving the house that day, I felt a shift within myself. The secrets that had once loomed large were no longer shadows but threads that connected my mother, Daniel, and me. I understood that love could be messy, complicated, and incomplete, and still be enough. And as we drove back, my daughter asleep in the back seat, I felt ready to tell her more of the story. Not all at once, but in small, honest pieces. Because some truths, even when delayed, deserved to be shared. By now, life had settled into a delicate rhythm. Daniel and I had found a way to connect that honored both the past and the present. Our meetings were no longer fraught with anxiety or uncertainty. They were calm, reflective, and often filled with laughter. I realized that the envelope in the attic hadn't just revealed a secret, it had given me the chance to rebuild a part of my life I didn't even know was missing. I spent more time reflecting on my mother, thinking about the courage it had taken for her to protect me in ways I hadn't understood. Every letter, every photograph, every pressed flower from that attic box became a reminder of her love and her human frailty. I began to write letters to her, not to send, but to capture the gratitude, the questions, the sorrow I felt for things left unsaid. One evening, I shared a memory of my mother with Daniel that I hadn't dared speak aloud before. He listened with quiet attention, nodding, sometimes smiling, sometimes sighing. In those moments, I understood the depth of shared memory. How two people could experience the same woman differently, yet still feel the same love. I also realized that forgiveness, both for my mother and myself, was essential. It wasn't about forgetting mistakes or secrets, it was about allowing love to thrive despite them. That realization didn't erase the years of uncertainty, but it softened them, giving me room to embrace both the pain and the joy that had shaped me. And as I closed my eyes that night, I finally felt a sense of completion. The attic had given up its secret, Daniel had given me a connection to the past, and my mother's love, though long hidden, had found its way home. The envelope in the attic had done more than reveal a secret, it had reshaped my life. I had faced truths I never expected, met a man I never imagined I would know, and learned that love isn't measured by blood alone, but by presence, intention, and courage. Sitting in my living room, watching my daughter play and feeling the quiet hum of our home, I understood what my mother had tried to teach me, that even the deepest fears and the longest silences cannot outweigh the power of truth and love. I folded the letter one last time, tucking it safely back into the box, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The past was no longer a shadow over my life. It was a bridge, connecting my mother, me, and Daniel, and giving me a chance to carry forward a legacy of honesty, resilience, and care. Some secrets, I realized, are not meant to stay hidden forever. And some envelopes are more than paper, they are the keepers of a life waiting to be understood. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and stay for more heartfelt tales from Aunt's Secret Corner.